All right. Today, I want to share with you a concept that has been really helpful for me as I train my own children, and especially as I serve in youth ministry. Um, I have I have dozens and dozens, actually, a couple of hundred teenagers that I work and interact with on a regular basis. And this concept that I'm sharing with you is something that I actually started with my own children before they hit their teenage years. So I think it's something that you can implement as a child. Is something that actually would be really good for your life. It's good for my life. It's just kind of a simple concept and a little bit of phrasing to figure out how to just drive home a point that I think will have radical, helpful, long-term fruit in your life and in the life of your family, in the life of your students. And that's just simply the concept that something doesn't have to be your fault to be your responsibility. This is a teaching that I've begun to incorporate on just a regular basis, and not even so much standing up as I teach in youth group, just in casual conversation as I see things happen that fit it. And it's just simply this: it's not your fault, but it's still your responsibility. Something doesn't have to be my fault to be my responsibility. I feel like we live in a culture right now where everybody wants to assign blame. Everybody wants to figure out why it's not their fault that something happened. And therefore, since it's not their fault that something happened, they don't have to do anything about it. But I can show you from Scripture, and that's what I want to do over the first little bit of this. I want to show you from Scripture why this is not a biblical concept. It's not a godly concept. Why it is kind of the opposite of the way of Jesus. And I can do that really, I think, simply through three passages that you were likely very familiar with. And these are ones that actually you can work really well with your children, whatever age they are, because these are ones that are not like super obscure passages. They're things that they would hear. So the first and perhaps the most powerful is just simply in Luke 10, the parable of the Good Samaritan. You know, it starts out with Jesus being asked, what's the greatest commandment? And he says, love my neighbor with all my heart, love the Lord with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. And then they ask, well, who's my neighbor? And so Jesus gives this powerful story of a man who is beaten and robbed and left for dead by the side of the road. And a priest goes by and ignores him, and a Levite goes by and ignores him. And then all of a sudden, a Samaritan, who is a despised person in the Jewish mindset, because a Samaritan was an ethnic half-breed and a religious compromiser. The Samaritans are the people who were left after Assyria invaded Israel, took away most of the captives, most of the Israelites' captives, scattered them around the empire, and then brought in people from the rest of the empire of Assyria into Israel. Those people stayed there. They started intermarrying with the Jews that were there. They worshiped God, and they worshiped their own idols and false gods. They worshiped God in ways and in means that God did not allow, that God did not prescribe. And so over time, the true ethnic Israel, those who were trying to keep themselves pure, those who were trying to keep themselves upright, those who thought they were obeying the law of God, began to despise the Samaritans. They would actually go completely out of their way to not pass through a Samaritan city, and would add miles to their journey just to stay away from the Samaritans. And so in this parable here, where the Samaritan comes along, the Good Samaritan comes along and takes this guy, bandages him, cleans him up, uses his own money to get a hotel for him and take care of his needs, I mean, is an incredible example of the way of Jesus, and also an incredible example of it's not your fault, but it can still be your responsibility. This Samaritan, it was not his fault the guy was robbed. It was not his fault that the guy was left for dead. And if the guy died, it wouldn't have been his fault. But he looked at him and he had compassion, and he used all of the resources that God gave him in order to help change this man's life. And I think just on a compassion level, this is a pretty incredible example. The second, it just kind of starts to go along with it. Galatians 6, chapter 2, the Apostle Paul says, bear one another's burdens and thus fulfill the law of Christ. You know, in everybody's life, I use this concept, we have a backpack, we have the thing that we're supposed to be carrying, And then we have boulders that come into our life. We have things that are too heavy for us to carry. They're burdens that are far beyond. It could be sickness. It could be, relationship challenges that we really have no control over or we can't get out of. It could be a car crash where all of a sudden you find yourself injured, incapacitated, unable to meet your bills, unable to do your job. There's all kinds of boulders that come into people's lives. And when we have boulders, we can't handle them ourselves. Now, I could look at somebody and say, well, I didn't cause that. That's not my fault that they're in this situation. And it might be true. I may have had nothing to do with the boulder that was in their life. But the Lord has remembered, he reminds me through the Good Samaritan story that things don't always have to be my fault for me to take responsibility to help make them better. And so in this, with bearing somebody's burden, step in. Okay, yeah, it's not your fault. Who cares? Like, we're not here to assign blame. We're here to make things right. And so it doesn't have to be your fault. Bear somebody's burden and fulfill the law of Christ. In James chapter 4:17, that's another one that you are probably familiar with, and your kids, if they're not, they should be. James says, so whoever knows the right thing to do and doesn't do it, for him it's a sin. He doesn't say, if you did wrong, you better make it right. He says, if you know the right thing to do and don't do it, to you it's a sin. Just one more, just a bonus one. The parable of the talents, Matthew 25:14-30. Jesus talks about people who are given resources by their master, and then they are charged with being responsible for those resources to multiply, to bear fruit. And so again, back to this, things don't have to be my fault to be my responsibility. And you're going to grow up in a world where all kinds of things are not your fault. All kinds of things are beyond your control. You didn't cause the problems in the country. You maybe didn't cause the problems in your household. You didn't cause the problems in your town, but you might be able to be a part of fixing it. And so, I think there's a broader concept that I've been walking through that is a really cool concept with this. And that's just kind of thinking of the creation of the world as the perfect peace of God, and sin entering the world as the vandalism on God's perfect peace. When Satan entered and tempted Adam and Eve, and when they sinned, it was like they vandalized this perfect creation that God had. And so now we are walking in a world that has been vandalized. We are walking in a world that has been broken and has been marred by the effects of sin. And while I do contribute to that, and while I definitely add sin to the pile of the world's problems, I didn't do most of the sinning for the cumulative total of the world. I didn't create the world systems and structures of oppression, of wrong. Just like in the same way, if somebody vandalizes something in my community, hopefully it wasn't me who did it. But just because I didn't do it doesn't mean that I can't make it right. And so as the people of Jesus, as those who have received peace and rest in our lives, we can help make right the vandalism of sin in the world. And I think that the household has so many great little illustrations for this. Hey, I'm not asking whose fault it was. I'm just asking you to take responsibility to make it well. And as a mom, as a dad, this is something that you do as a regular thing. Like, you don't look around saying, well, I didn't cause this mess, I'm not cleaning it up. Like, as a runner of a household, you're all the time doing things that are not your fault, but you have to take responsibility for it. And I think that is an incredible concept to pass on. So let me just blaze through a few great examples of this, how this can work out in your house. So spills and messes. There's a spill on the ground, there's a mess, there's food or garbage on the ground. We could do a big investigation. We could get everybody together and try to determine who was the one who was a slob, who was the one who was messy, who didn't throw away their stuff, who didn't pick it up. And everybody's going, well, I didn't do it. Well, they did it. I didn't do it. And poor only children, they don't really have anybody to blame. But multiple children, you can always scapegoat somebody else. But as a parent, I want to get past trying to find and assign blame. And I want to get my children past deflecting with blame, because maybe they're accurate, maybe they're not. I don't really care at this point. I want to teach them to be responsible. So if you see a spill, if you see a mess, I don't care if you did it or not. If God's giving you the power to make it right, make it right. That's great. You can do it as service to the Lord. Even if you can't stand your brother or sister right now, don't do it for their sake. Do it just as an act of service to Jesus. It doesn't have to be your fault. Do it as an act of service to mom and dad. It doesn't have to be your fault. It can be your responsibility. Your kids are going to be in group projects at school. That's one of the joys or awful things about being in schools, being assigned to a group, and never in the history of a group project has everybody carried their weight the same. And it can be incredibly frustrating to be in a group where somebody is just coasting through and they're expecting you to do it. And I understand that that's not your fault. I understand oftentimes you didn't pick the group, but I can tell you this, the rest of your life, you are going to be surrounded by people of different abilities, different work ethics, different drives. And if you sink down to the lowest common denominator and say, well, nobody else is carrying their load, I'm not going to, you're going to have a miserable life. You're going to have an unfulfilling life. You're going to have an unfruitful life. Or you can say, hey, it's not my fault that this person's a slug. It's not my fault that this person is not carrying their weight, but it is my responsibility to do the best that I can, to get the best grade that I can. I can honor the Lord in the process. So even in a group project at school, it doesn't have to be your fault that that person didn't do their job, but it's great practice for the rest of your life of learning to carry, because God blessed you with greater capacity to carry that load. Lost toy. You didn't lose it. Why would you look around? Lost iPhone, lost earbuds. I mean, I feel like we have a daily practice in our house of finding somebody's earbuds laying around. And most of the time I didn't lose them, but I'm still going to look for them. Now, in my part, it's because I probably paid for them, so I want to look for them. But those are great ones. Hey, I'm not saying that you lost the toy. I'm not saying that you misplaced it. I'm not saying that you were the last one with the remote control. That's not what I'm asking. I'm not blaming you. I'm just saying, can you help take responsibility for making it right? Can you be a blessing? Can you take one more step to being a helpful grown-up by doing that? Arguments among siblings. Hey, they started it. I don't care. Can you help end it? Can you be bigger? Let's just assume that they started it. Instead of nailing it down, what if that means that you're more mature, that you're in a better position right now? Can you take responsibility for ending it? Can you just at least own your part in it? Even if they started it, own your responsibility and how it got to where it is now. The whole argument may not be your fault, but you can take responsibility. Why? Because it doesn't have to be your fault to take responsibility to make it better. In our community, we can have that happen. Walking along the street in my neighborhood, there's trash laid out. A lot of times as the garbage people come, they, they'll empty the garbage and some of the stuff will fall out. Not my fault. I'm not the garbage man, but I want a beautiful community. So I can take responsibility for picking this up. I'm on a hike. I find a beer bottle. I don't drink beer. I didn't throw this beer bottle in the middle of the woods. Not my fault. But I want a beautiful woods. I want to take care of God's creation. So I want to take responsibility for it. Forgotten items, supporting friends, miscommunication. I feel like I communicate everything perfectly. Otherwise, I wouldn't say it, right? How did they not understand? Not my fault that you didn't understand what I'm saying. But you know what? I can take responsibility. I can apologize for not being clear, and I can try again. I can take responsibility. This is a concept that I feel like we need to start introducing when a child is little, and it can be so freeing for a kid, because this whole blame thing, that why are you asking me to do something when I didn't cause it? That leads to misery. It's an exhausting emotional thing, but if we can get past it, yeah, sometimes we do need to determine whose fault something is. But in many times in a household, we just need to make it right. We just need to fix the problem. And if we end up having a household where everybody buys into like, it's not my fault, but I can be responsible for helping make it right, then actually a lot worse, I think it ends up solving a lot of the fault issue in the first place. Because if you become the kind of person that takes responsibility for cleaning up a mess in the floor, you start to become the kind of person that doesn't make messes in the floor because, it's a pain in the neck to clean it up. If you become the kind of person who works hard and raises the level of your small group project, then you start to become the kind of person who is more discerning about the group that you'll be a part of for it. And you end up solving issues like this. And more importantly, back to Luke chapter 10, you get to be the Good Samaritan. You get to be the Jesus figure in the story. You get to be a part of God's changing work. The sin of the world was not God's fault, but the redemption of the world, God took responsibility for because he knew we were a mess and that we couldn't do it. And so Jesus came and Jesus bore my sin and Jesus bore your sin. Jesus took the penalty for what we were doing because even though it wasn't his fault, he took responsibility for making it right. And I want to be like Jesus. So even if it's not my fault, as best as I can, I want to take responsibility for healing the vandalism of the world that sin's caused, cleaning up the vandalism of whoever did it in my house, and righting the brokenness of the relationships to the best of my ability. It's not my job to be the hero. I can't solve every problem. But if I can get past fault, if I can get past blame, if I can be a person who takes responsibility for solutions, then I become a blessing to the world. And this is the concept that I think that we should own ourselves. We should use this vocabulary, not my fault. I can still take responsibility, and we should pass it on to our kids. And if we do that, then let's trust that the Lord's going to work in our hearts, going to work in our children's hearts, work in our little household community, and we will be a blessing to one another and a blessing to the world. Try it out. Let me know how it works. I'd love to hear from you.